The music had not even reached its highest note when Elena Marchetti felt the first sharp sting shoot through her heel. She gritted her teeth and kept walking across the polished marble floor of the grand ballroom, her borrowed shoes pressing into skin that was never meant to carry her this far. She had no time to stop. She had no time to think about pain. Somewhere behind a velvet curtain, a torn gown was waiting for her needle, and if she did not fix it before the next dance began, her mother's small shop would lose its only wealthy client. Elena was not supposed to be seen tonight. She was supposed to slip through the shadows of the Duke's winter ball unnoticed, deliver her skill, and disappear before anyone important asked who she was. But the shoes her employer had lent her were a full size too small, chosen in a hurry from a shelf of forgotten things, and now, every step across the cold marble felt like walking on broken glass. She pressed forward anyway. The ballroom glowed with hundreds of candles, their light catching on crystal glasses and jeweled collars. Laughter rose and fell like waves. Nobody looked down at the floor. Nobody looked at a plain young woman in a borrowed dress, moving quickly along the edge of the room. That was exactly how Elena wanted it. She had grown up learning that attention from the wealthy was rarely kind, and the safest place for a girl like her was in the corners, not the center. She reached the servants' passage at last, ducked behind the velvet curtain, and let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like an hour. Her feet throbbed. She looked down for the first time since she had put the shoes on, and her stomach turned cold. Both heels were torn open. Thin lines of red had soaked through her stockings and stained the inside of the shoes a dark, wet color. She had not even felt the skin break. She had been too focused on not stumbling, not falling, not becoming the center of a story she wanted no part of. For a moment, she considered removing the shoes entirely and finishing her work barefoot. But barefoot in a ducal household was its own kind of scandal, the sort of thing whispered about for weeks. So she pressed a folded handkerchief into each shoe, wincing at the sting, and told herself it would hold until she was done. The torn gown belonged to Lady Beatrice Ashworth, a guest of considerable importance and even greater impatience. She had ripped the hem while dancing too enthusiastically near a marble column, and she wanted it fixed before the next set of dances began, not a moment later. Elena knelt at her feet in a small side room, needle moving fast and sure despite the pain climbing up her own legs. "You work quickly," Lady Beatrice said, examining her reflection in a tall mirror, rather than looking at the girl kneeling before her. "Thank you, my lady," Elena answered, keeping her eyes on the fabric. "Faster would be better." Elena said nothing. She simply worked faster, her fingers steady even though her feet screamed beneath her. When the final stitch was tied off, Lady Beatrice swept away without another word, already moving back toward the noise and light of the ballroom, leaving Elena alone in the small side room with her own quiet suffering. She allowed herself 30 seconds to sit on a low stool and breathe. She unwrapped the handkerchiefs, saw that the bleeding had not stopped, and wrapped them again more tightly. Her mother would need her back at the shop before midnight. There was still the matter of collecting payment from the household steward, a task that meant walking back through the ballroom itself, since the steward preferred to conduct his business where he could keep an eye on the guests. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and stepped back into the noise. The ballroom was even more crowded now than before. Guests moved in bright clusters, jewelry catching the candlelight, voices rising in easy laughter. Elena kept close to the wall, moving with quick, careful steps, trying to keep the pain from showing on her face. She did not know that with every step, she was leaving behind something she could not see. The marble floor, pale and smooth, held onto the faint marks of her passing. Small, dark red prints, no larger than a coin, appeared beneath her feet and vanished behind her into the crowd of moving skirts and polished shoes. No one glanced down. Why would they? At a ball like this, eyes were trained upward, toward faces, toward jewelry, toward the great chandeliers overhead. The floor was simply something to stand on, not something to study. Elena reached the far side of the room, where the household steward, a stern man named Edmund Price, stood near a table of refreshments, counting coins into small velvet pouches for the evening's hired help. She waited her turn patiently, shifting her weight from one aching foot to the other, trying to look composed. "Marchetti," Edmund said without looking up, checking a list in his hand. "The gown is finished?" "Yes, sir." Lady Beatrice was pleased. He handed her a small pouch, heavier than she expected, and finally glanced at her face. Something in his expression flickered, just for a moment, but he said nothing more, and turned to the next name on his list. Elena tucked the pouch into the folds of her dress and turned to leave, grateful the transaction had taken no longer than necessary. She did not know that a pair of sharp eyes across the room had already noticed something far more troubling than a tired seamstress collecting her pay. Duke Alessandro Varon stood near one of the tall windows, a glass of wine untouched in his hand, half listening to a conversation about trade routes that held no interest for him. He had attended 100 balls like this one, and everyone blurred into the last, full of the same faces saying the same things. His mind wandered easily on nights like these, and tonight it had wandered down toward the floor, toward the pattern of light and shadow the dancers made as they moved. That was when he saw it. A small mark, dark against the pale marble, near the edge of the dance floor. Then another, a few steps further along. He blinked, thinking perhaps it was a trick of the candlelight, a spilled drop of wine from a careless guest. But as his eyes followed the faint trail, he realized it was not scattered the way a spill would be. It followed a path, a deliberate, unbroken path, leading from the direction of the side rooms, across the open floor, toward the refreshment table. He excused himself from the conversation about trade routes with a polite nod and stepped away, moving closer to get a better look. Up close, there was no mistaking it. The marks were small, round, and unmistakably the color of blood. His first thought was alarm. Someone was hurt, and hurt badly enough to leave a trail like this, yet no one in the ballroom seemed to notice or care. His second thought, quieter and more troubling, was a memory he had spent years trying to bury. A memory of another set of footsteps, years ago, in another grand house, that no one had noticed until it was far too late. He followed the trail with his eyes, tracing it back across the crowded floor, past dancing couples and clustered conversations, until it led him to a young woman standing near the refreshment table, tucking a small pouch into her dress, her face pale beneath a practiced calm. She was already turning to leave. The Duke moved through the crowd with the quiet authority of a man used to being obeyed without needing to raise his voice. Guests parted for him without realizing they were doing it, the way a crowd instinctively makes room for someone important. He kept his eyes on the young woman, watching the careful, controlled way she walked, the slight hesitation in each step that most people would never notice unless they were looking for it. He was looking for it. By the time he reached the edge of the dance floor, the young woman had already slipped past the refreshment table and was moving toward one of the side doors, clearly intending to leave the ballroom the same way she had entered it, quietly and without attention. The Duke quickened his pace, though he kept his expression calm, unwilling to cause a scene before he understood what was happening. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach her over the music. Elena froze. For one terrible moment, she thought she had done something wrong, forgotten some rule of conduct she did not know existed. She turned slowly, her heart suddenly pounding harder than her feet ached, and found herself looking up into the face of a man she recognized instantly, though she had never met him before. There was no mistaking the Duke of the household, the man whose portrait hung above the great staircase, the man every servant in the building spoke of with a mixture of respect and quiet fear. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into the small, careful bow expected of someone in her position, though the motion sent a fresh wave of pain through her feet. "Are you injured?" he asked, and something in his tone was different from what she expected. There was no scolding in it, no impatience, only a quiet, direct concern that caught her completely off guard. "No, Your Grace," she answered quickly, the practiced lie of a girl who had learned early never to be a burden. "I am quite well." The Duke's eyes moved briefly toward the floor behind her, toward the faint, telltale marks that led directly to where she now stood, and then back to her face. Elena felt her stomach drop as she understood what he had seen. "Forgive me," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear it clearly over the music. "But I do not believe that is true." Elena said nothing. There was nothing to say. The evidence was there on the floor, for anyone with sharp enough eyes to see, and apparently, the Duke's eyes were sharper than most. She felt heat rise in her face, not from pain now, but from the sudden fear of what might happen next. Would she be dismissed? Would her mother's shop lose its standing with the household? Would this single, careless mistake, with an ill-fitting pair of shoes, undo everything her family had worked so carefully to build? She had no way of knowing that the Duke was not thinking about scandal or embarrassment at all. He was thinking about a hallway in his childhood home, and a girl who had suffered in silence until silence was all that was left of her. He was thinking about a promise he had made to himself long ago, one he had never spoken aloud to another living soul, that he would not let such a thing happen again in any house that bore his name. The music continued around them, oblivious, but for Duke Alessandro Varin, the entire evening had already narrowed down to one single point of concern, standing quietly before him, in a pair of shoes stained red beneath the candlelight, trying very hard to pretend that nothing at all was wrong. The music did not stop, but for Elena, the entire ballroom seemed to shrink down to the small space between herself and the Duke standing before her. She could feel curious glances beginning to drift toward them, guests noticing that their host had paused to speak with a young woman none of them recognized. She wanted nothing more than to disappear through the nearest door. "Your Grace," she said again, choosing her words with great care, "I assure you, it is nothing that requires your attention. I should return to my work." "Your work," the Duke repeated, glancing again at the faint red marks on the marble behind her, "appears to have cost you a great deal already." Elena's cheeks burned. She had spent her whole life avoiding exactly this kind of moment, the kind where the eyes of someone powerful landed on her and refused to look away. Her mother had taught her from a young age that the safest place for a girl without title or fortune was in the background, doing good work quietly and never giving anyone reason to remember her face. Tonight, of all nights, that lesson had failed her completely. "Please," she said quietly, glancing past him toward the crowd that was beginning to take notice. "People are watching." "Let them watch," the Duke said, and something in his voice carried a weight that silenced any argument she might have made. "I would rather they watch me care for an injured guest in my home than watch me ignore one." The word guest struck her strangely. She was no guest. She was hired help, a seamstress's daughter brought in through the servant's entrance to mend a torn hem, someone whose presence in the ballroom was meant to be temporary and invisible. Yet the Duke had used the word without hesitation, as though the distinction mattered to him less than it mattered to everyone else in the room. He raised a hand, and to the astonishment of everyone nearby, the musicians in the corner of the room slowly noticed the small gesture and let their instruments fall silent one by one. The dancing couples stumbled to a confused stop, murmurs rippling outward through the crowd like water disturbed by a stone. Elena's heart pounded so hard she was certain everyone around her could hear it. "Your Grace, please," she whispered, mortified. "There is no need for this." "There is every need," he said, and though his voice remained calm, there was something unmovable in it, the tone of a man who had made a decision and did not intend to be argued out of it. The silence that followed the stopped music was thick and strange. Guests who had been laughing moments before now stood frozen, uncertain what was happening, their eyes moving between their host and the plain young woman standing before him. Whispers passed quickly from one cluster of guests to another, questions with no answers yet attached to them. Who was she? Why had the Duke stopped everything for her? What could a servant girl possibly have done to deserve this kind of attention? Lady Beatrice Ashworth, still nearby with her freshly mended gown, watched the scene with narrowed eyes, a slow, calculating expression crossing her face. She recognized the seamstress at once, the same quiet girl who had knelt at her feet not half an hour earlier, fixing a torn hem without complaint. It seemed impossible that such an unremarkable creature could be the cause of the sudden silence spreading across the ballroom. The Duke, seemingly unbothered by the hundreds of eyes now fixed on him, gestured toward a nearby chair, one usually reserved for elderly guests, who tired easily during long evenings of dancing. "Please," he said to Elena, "sit." "Your Grace, I could not possibly. I am not asking as a request," he said gently, though there was no cruelty in the correction, only quiet insistence. "Please, sit." Elena, aware that refusing him further in front of so many watching eyes would only draw more attention rather than less, finally lowered herself into the offered chair, wincing as her weight shifted onto her injured feet. The Duke knelt before her, without hesitation, an act so far outside the expected behavior of a man of his rank that a fresh wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd surrounding them. A duke did not kneel. Not for servants, not for guests, not for anyone beneath his own station. Yet there he was, lowering himself to the marble floor in front of a seamstress, his attention fixed entirely on her, as though the hundreds of watching eyes belonged to no one of consequence at all. Elena hesitated, torn between the deep discomfort of the moment and the strange, unfamiliar sense that his concern was genuine, rather than performed for the benefit of onlookers. Slowly, reluctantly, she extended one foot slightly from beneath the hem of her borrowed dress. The Duke's expression did not change to disgust or pity, the reactions she had braced herself for. Instead, something harder settled across his features, something that looked almost like anger, though she understood quickly that the anger was not directed at her. "These shoes do not fit you," he said quietly. "They are borrowed, Your Grace. My own were not fine enough for an evening such as this. And no one thought to check that they fit before sending you across a ballroom floor for hours at a time?" Elena had no answer for that. It had simply never occurred to anyone, herself included, that comfort mattered more than appearance, for a girl whose entire purpose that evening was to remain unseen. She had accepted the pain as the price of doing her work well, the same way she accepted long hours bent over needlework by candlelight, the same way she accepted every small discomfort that came with being poor, in a world built for the comfortable. The Duke rose to his feet, and when he spoke again, his voice carried further, meant now for the crowd, rather than for Elena alone. "This young woman has spent this evening mending garments for my guests, walking across this floor in shoes that injured her with every step, and not one of you noticed." The silence that followed was heavier than before. No one in the crowd seemed to know how to respond to being addressed so directly, so accusingly, by their host. Lady Beatrice's face had gone pale, understanding with sudden clarity whose gown had caused the girl's long hours of walking that evening. "I will not have suffering go unnoticed in this house," the Duke continued, his voice steady, but carrying an unmistakable edge of old, private pain beneath its calm surface. "Not tonight, not ever again." Elena watched him, confused by the sudden intensity in his words, unaware of the years of memory and regret that had brought him to this exact moment, kneeling before a stranger on a ballroom floor, refusing to let her pain pass by, unseen the way another's had, once, long ago. Edmund Price, the household steward, moved quickly through the frozen crowd toward his employer, his face tight with the particular worry of a man who had spent years managing the smooth surface of events, and now watched that surface crack in front of hundreds of witnesses. He leaned close to the Duke and spoke in a low voice meant to be private, though several nearby guests strained to hear regardless. "Your Grace," Edmund said carefully, "perhaps this matter would be better handled away from the ballroom." The Duke did not look away from Elena. "The matter has already happened in front of the ballroom, Edmund. Hiding it now would only make it worse." Edmund's mouth tightened, but he said nothing further. He understood, as any good steward eventually learned to understand, that once the Duke made a decision, arguing against it rarely produced anything but wasted breath. Instead, he turned his attention to practical matters, the kind of quiet efficiency that had kept the household running smoothly for years. "I will send for the housekeeper," Edmund said. "She keeps supplies for minor injuries in the linen room." "Good," the Duke said. "And have someone bring a proper pair of shoes, something that fits." Elena, still seated in the chair meant for elderly guests, felt the strange sensation of being discussed, as though she were both present and somehow distant from the conversation happening around her. She wanted to protest, to insist that none of this was necessary, that she would simply return home and tend to her own feet with the same quiet practicality she applied to every small hardship in her life. But something in the set of the Duke's shoulders told her that protest would accomplish nothing, except prolonging the very attention she wished to escape. The housekeeper arrived within minutes, a stout, efficient woman named Margaret Ellis, who took one look at Elena's feet and made a small, disapproving sound in her throat, the universal sound of an older woman who had seen a great deal of foolishness in her time and had little patience left for more of it. "Sit still, child," Margaret said, kneeling, with far less ceremony than the Duke had shown, unwrapping the makeshift bandage of handkerchiefs with brisk, practiced hands. These shoes were never meant for a night of standing, let alone a night of walking. "I did not have another option," Elena said quietly, embarrassed by the continued attention. "There is always another option," Margaret muttered. Cleaning the wounds with a soft cloth dipped in water, a young footman had hurried to fetch. Even if the option is simply telling someone the truth before the damage is done. Elena said nothing to that. She had spent so many years learning to hide small hardships that the idea of simply telling someone the truth, of admitting discomfort before it became a crisis, felt almost foreign to her, a language she had never been taught to speak. The Duke remained standing nearby throughout the housekeeper's work, his posture unreadable to most of the watching crowd but carrying, to anyone who looked closely enough, the tension of a man remembering something he would rather forget. Lady Beatrice Ashworth, still hovering at the edge of the small gathering, studied him with sharp, curious eyes, sensing that there was more beneath this moment than a simple act of hospitality toward an injured servant. "Your Grace," she said carefully, stepping forward once Margaret had finished her work and Elena's feet were properly wrapped. "This is a remarkable kindness you are showing." "It is not kindness," the Duke said, his voice quiet but firm. "It is simply what should have happened before anyone was hurt." Lady Beatrice's eyebrows rose slightly at that, though she said nothing further. She glanced down at Elena, seated now with her feet properly tended, and something in her expression shifted from suspicion to a kind of thoughtful reassessment, as though she were seeing the young seamstress for the first time, rather than merely a pair of skilled hands that had mended her gown an hour earlier. The musicians, uncertain whether they were meant to resume playing, waited with their instruments raised but silent, watching the small drama unfolding at the edge of the dance floor. The Duke noticed their hesitation and gave a small nod, signaling that the evening's festivities could continue, though he made no move himself to rejoin the crowd of guests. Slowly, the music began again, tentative at first and then gradually returning to its earlier confidence, though the mood in the room had shifted in a way that no one could quite name. Conversations resumed, but they carried an undercurrent of curiosity now, every guest wondering the same unspoken question. Who was this girl, and why did the Duke care so much about a pair of injured feet that he had stopped an entire ball to address them? Elena, watching the room slowly return to its previous rhythm, felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease. The immediate crisis had passed, but something had changed in the air around her, something she did not yet understand, and was not entirely certain she wanted to understand. She glanced up at the Duke, who was watching her with an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between concern and something older, something that seemed to reach back far beyond this single evening. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice quiet but sincere, "though I confess, I do not understand why you troubled yourself so greatly over someone you have never met." The Duke was quiet for a long moment before answering, his eyes drifting briefly toward the tall windows at the far end of the ballroom, as though searching for words in the darkness beyond the glass. "Sometimes," he said at last, "the smallest details are the ones that matter most. And sometimes, by the time someone notices them, it is already too late to help." Elena did not understand the full weight behind his words, could not have known the memories that shaped them, but something in his tone told her this was not simply a polite excuse, offered to smooth over an awkward moment. There was history behind those words, old and unresolved, and for reasons she could not name, she found herself curious to understand it. The proper shoes Edmund had sent for arrived within the half hour, delivered by a young footman named Oliver, who looked deeply uncomfortable to be handing footwear to a seamstress in front of half the ballroom's curious guests. Elena accepted them gratefully, relieved to finally remove the ruined, blood-stained pair that had caused so much trouble that evening. The new shoes fit properly, soft leather without the pinch and bite of the borrowed pair, and when she stood carefully to test them, the relief on her face was immediate and unmistakable. Margaret Ellis, satisfied that her patient was properly cared for, gathered her supplies and gave the Duke a small, approving nod before disappearing back toward the household's working quarters. "Better?" the Duke asked. "Much better, Your Grace," Elena said, and for the first time that evening, a small, genuine smile crossed her face. "Thank you. You should not thank me for something that should have been prevented in the first place," he said, though there was no harshness in the words, only a lingering trace of frustration directed at circumstances rather than at her. Elena studied him for a moment, curiosity overtaking her earlier discomfort. There was something in the careful way he spoke, something guarded and precise, that suggested this evening's events had touched on more than simple hospitality. She wanted to ask, but propriety held her tongue. A seamstress did not question a duke, however unusual his behavior had been. "If I may," she said instead, choosing her words carefully, "I should return to my duties. My mother will expect me home soon, and there may be other garments requiring attention before the evening ends." "There will be no more mending tonight," the duke said. "Not from you." Elena blinked, uncertain how to respond to such a direct statement. "Your Grace, it is my work. I am grateful for the household's continued patronage of my mother's shop, and I would not wish tonight's misfortune to affect that." "It will not affect anything except perhaps how carefully my household considers the comfort of those who work within it," the duke said. "You have done your work for this evening. Rest now. A carriage will take you home when you are ready." The offer of a carriage, something Elena had never before been extended by any noble household, left her momentarily speechless. Seamstresses walked, or if fortunate, rode in the back of a delivery cart alongside bolts of fabric and spools of thread. They did not ride in a duke's carriage, cushioned and warm, through the cold night streets. "That is not necessary, Your Grace," she managed finally. "Necessary or not, it is what will happen," he said, and there was the faintest hint of humor beneath the firmness of his tone now, as though he recognized how strange his own insistence must sound, and found some private amusement in it despite himself. Across the room, Lady Beatrice Ashworth watched this continued exchange with growing interest, her earlier suspicion giving way entirely to fascination. She drifted closer to a cluster of other guests, her voice pitched low but carrying just far enough to be heard by those nearby. "I have never seen him behave this way toward anyone," she murmured to a companion, a woman named Charlotte Hale who had been watching the scene with equal curiosity. "Not toward guests of the highest standing, let alone toward a seamstress." "Do you suppose there is some connection between them?" Charlotte asked, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Some history neither has spoken of." "I could not say," Lady Beatrice admitted, "but I intend to find out." The whispers spread through the ballroom, with the particular speed reserved for interesting scandal, guest to guest, cluster to cluster, until by the time the evening's dancing resumed in full, nearly everyone present had heard some version of the story, each retelling slightly more elaborate than the last. By the following morning, Elena knew, the tale would have grown well beyond the simple truth of a pair of ill-fitting shoes and an observant duke, and there was little she could do to control what people chose to believe. For now, though, she allowed herself to sit quietly in the borrowed chair, her feet finally comfortable in proper shoes, watching the glittering crowd move and laugh and dance as though nothing unusual had happened at all. The Duke remained nearby, not hovering exactly, but present in a way that felt deliberate, as though he wished to ensure she truly was recovering before he allowed himself to return to his other duties as host. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" Elena said finally, emboldened perhaps by the strange intimacy of the evening's events. "You may. Why did this matter so much to you? A stranger's discomfort, in the middle of your own ball. Surely there were 100 other things demanding your attention tonight." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting once more toward the tall windows and the darkness beyond them. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, carrying a weight that told Elena she had touched on something far deeper than she had intended. "There was someone, once," he said slowly, "who suffered quietly, in a house much like this one, and no one noticed until there was nothing left to be done. I made myself a promise after that I would not let such a thing happen again, not while I had the power to prevent it." Elena said nothing, sensing that this was not a story meant to be pressed further. Not tonight, in the middle of a crowded ballroom with 100 curious eyes still drifting occasionally in their direction. But she filed the words away carefully, understanding that whatever had happened, it had left a mark on this man deep enough to reshape the way he moved through the world, deep enough to make him stop an entire ball for the sake of a stranger's bleeding feet. The carriage ride home was unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. The seats were soft, lined with dark velvet, and warm blankets sat folded neatly in the corner, as though the household anticipated every possible comfort a passenger might require. She sat stiffly at first, unused to such luxury, half expecting someone to appear and tell her there had been a mistake, that carriages like this were not meant for girls like her. No one came to correct the mistake, if it was one. The carriage rolled smoothly through the cold night streets, past shuttered shops and quiet houses, until it reached the narrow lane where her mother's small shop sat wedged between a bakery and a shoemaker's storefront, both long closed for the evening. Her mother, Clara Marchetti, was waiting at the window when the carriage pulled up, her face a mixture of worry and confusion at the sight of such a fine vehicle stopping outside their modest home. She hurried to the door before Elena had even stepped down, her eyes wide with questions she could not quite form fast enough. "Elena, what has happened? Why are you arriving in a duke's carriage?" "It is a long story, Mama," Elena said, wincing slightly as she stepped down, her new shoes far kinder to her feet than the borrowed pair had been, though the wounds beneath still ached with every movement. "Let us go inside, and I will explain everything." Clara ushered her daughter into the small, warm kitchen at the back of the shop, sitting her down at the worn wooden table where they had shared countless quiet meals together over the years. She fetched a cup of warm tea without being asked, setting it before Elena with the same practiced care she used when threading a needle in dim candlelight. "Now," Clara said, settling into the chair across from her daughter, "tell me everything." Elena recounted the evening slowly, starting with the ill-fitting shoes and the long hours of walking across the ballroom floor, moving through the discovery of the blood on the marble, and finally arriving at the strange, unexpected kindness of the Duke himself. Clara listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from concern to disbelief, to something more thoughtful as the story unfolded. "He knelt before you," Clara repeated slowly, as though testing the words to see if they could possibly be true, in front of all his guests. "Yes, Mama. And he sent you home in his own carriage." "Yes." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her own teacup absently. She had lived long enough, worked hard enough among the households of the wealthy, to understand that such behavior from a man of the Duke's standing was not ordinary. Kindness toward servants existed, certainly, but rarely so publicly, rarely with such disregard for how it might look to others. "Did he say why?" Clara asked finally. Elena hesitated, remembering the Duke's quiet words about someone who had suffered once and gone unnoticed until it was too late. She was not certain the story was hers to share, even with her own mother, not yet, not until she understood more of it herself. "He said he did not wish for suffering to go unnoticed in his home," Elena said carefully. "That is all he told me." Clara studied her daughter's face for a long moment, sensing perhaps that there was more to the story than what had been spoken aloud, but she did not press further. She had raised Elena to be careful, to be private, to guard herself against a world that rarely rewarded openness from girls without title or fortune, and she trusted her daughter's judgment now as she always had. "Well," Clara said finally, rising to fetch a clean cloth and a small jar of salve from the shelf above the hearth, "whatever his reasons, we should see to your feet properly before you sleep. A duke's kindness will not heal a wound on its own." Elena allowed her mother to tend to the injuries left by the borrowed shoes, wincing occasionally as the salve was applied, grateful for the familiar comfort of her mother's careful hands after such a strange and overwhelming evening. As Clara worked, she found herself thinking not of the pain in her feet, nor even of the humiliation of the entire ballroom watching her be fussed over by its host, but of the Duke's face, as he had spoken of someone who suffered once and was never noticed in time. There had been something in his eyes during that brief admission, something old and unhealed, and Elena found herself wondering, despite every instinct telling her to let the matter rest, who that someone had been, and what exactly had happened to them. Sleep did not come easily that night. Elena lay awake in her small bed above the shop, staring at the shadows cast by the moon through her thin curtain, replaying the evening over and over in her mind. She thought of the silence that had fallen over the ballroom when the Duke raised his hand, the murmurs that followed, the strange, unshakable feeling that something significant had shifted, not just for her, but for him as well. She did not know, as she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, that across the city, in the grand quiet of his own private study, Duke Alessandro Varin sat awake as well, staring into the dying embers of a fire, his thoughts pulled back through years of memory, to a hallway much like the one in his ballroom, and a set of small, quiet footsteps that no one had thought to follow until it was far too late to matter. The fire in the study had burned low, but Alessandro made no move to add more wood. He sat in the same worn leather chair his father had once occupied, staring into the embers with the particular stillness of a man revisiting a memory he had spent years trying to keep buried beneath the ordinary business of running a great household. He was 11 years old the first time he noticed. His younger sister, a quiet, gentle girl named Isabel, had begun keeping to her room more often than usual, claiming tiredness, claiming a persistent chill she could not seem to shake. Their parents, occupied with the endless demands of managing their estate and its many guests, had noticed little beyond a passing comment that Isabel seemed pale lately, followed by an equally passing instruction to the household physician to look in on her when convenient. Convenient had taken too long. Alessandro remembered, with the particular clarity that only painful memories retained, the evening he had finally gone looking for his sister himself, worried by her continued absence from the family's evening meal. He had found her in her room, weaker than he had ever seen her, having quietly endured a growing illness for weeks, without telling anyone how serious it had become, afraid of being a burden, afraid of interrupting the busy lives of the adults around her. By the time the physician was finally summoned with real urgency, it was too late to do anything but ease her final days with what comfort could be offered. She passed quietly, the same way she had lived those final weeks, without complaint, without demanding the attention her condition had desperately required. Alessandro had been young, but not too young to understand the terrible lesson buried in his sister's death. It was not illness alone that had taken her. It was silence. It was the quiet, invisible suffering of someone who had learned, perhaps from watching the household around her, that her discomfort mattered less than the comfort of everyone else, that drawing attention to her own pain was somehow an imposition rather than a simple, honest request for help. He had made himself a promise in the days following her burial, a promise no one else in the household ever knew existed. He would not allow such invisible suffering within his own walls again, not while he had the power and position to prevent it. He would watch more carefully than anyone thought necessary. He would notice the things others overlooked. For years, that promise had remained largely theoretical, a private code of conduct that shaped small decisions no one else noticed. Extra attention paid to tired servants, careful questions asked of guests who seemed unwell, quiet instructions to his staff to report any signs of hardship among the household's working people, rather than simply expecting them to endure it silently. It had never, until tonight, demanded anything so public, so dramatic, as stopping an entire ball in front of hundreds of guests. But the moment he had seen those small, dark marks on the marble floor, something in him had recognized, with sudden and undeniable clarity, the same pattern he had failed to notice in time, all those years ago. A person quietly suffering, walking through a house full of people who simply were not looking closely enough to see it. He had not been able to walk past it again, not this time. He thought of Elena's face when he had finally approached her, the careful, practiced calm she had worn, even as her feet bled beneath a borrowed pair of shoes, the immediate instinct to deny that anything was wrong, rather than ask for help. It was the same instinct Isabel had carried, the same quiet endurance that had cost her everything. He rose from his chair finally, restless with the weight of old memory, and moved to the window overlooking the dark gardens below. Somewhere across the city, in a small shop wedged between a bakery and a shoemaker, a young woman was likely lying awake as well, wondering at the strange behavior of a duke she had never met before tonight. He did not yet know what he intended to do about the strange pull he felt toward her, a pull that went beyond simple guilt over an old, unrelated tragedy. There was something in her quiet dignity, in the careful way she had tried to spare him and everyone else the trouble of her own pain, that reminded him powerfully of his sister, yet also felt entirely, distinctly her own. He was not certain yet what that meant, only that he could not simply return to his ordinary routine, as though the evening's events had been nothing more than a passing curiosity. Tomorrow, he decided, he would find a reason to see her again. Not out of pity, and not merely out of the old, unhealed guilt that had driven his actions tonight, but because some quiet instinct told him that Elena Marchetti was not someone he wished to let disappear back into the invisible background of the world, simply because propriety demanded it. He extinguished the last of the study's candles, and made his way to bed, though sleep, when it finally came, was thin and restless, filled with half-formed images of marble floors, and small, dark footprints, leading toward a face he could not quite make out in the shifting dreams, uncertain whether it belonged to his sister or to the young woman he had met only hours before. By mid-morning, the story had already traveled far beyond the walls of the Duke's ballroom. Servants carried whispered accounts to neighboring households while delivering messages. Guests who had witnessed the event firsthand repeated it over breakfast tables to family members who had stayed home the previous evening, each retelling adding small details that had not actually occurred, until the tale bore only a loose resemblance to what had truly happened. In one version, Elena had fainted dramatically in the middle of the dance floor, and the Duke had carried her personally to safety. In another, she was rumored to be a long-lost relation of a minor noble family, her humble appearance merely a disguise. In yet another, whispered with particular relish among a group of younger guests, it was suggested that the Duke's interest went far beyond simple concern, that something more romantic had already begun between them, sparked in that single dramatic moment on the ballroom floor. Lady Beatrice Ashworth, true to her earlier promise to Charlotte Hale, spent the morning making careful inquiries of her own, questioning household staff and fellow guests alike, piecing together whatever fragments of truth she could separate from the growing pile of exaggeration. By early afternoon, she had learned enough to satisfy at least part of her curiosity, though the deeper question of why the Duke had reacted so strongly remained frustratingly unanswered. "She is a seamstress," Beatrice reported to Charlotte over afternoon tea, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who prided herself on gathering accurate information. "Her mother runs a small shop. Nothing remarkable about her family at all, as far as I can determine." "Then why would he behave so strangely over her?" Charlotte asked, clearly disappointed that the explanation lacked the romantic drama the rest of society seemed eager to assign it. "That," Beatrice admitted, "I have not yet discovered, but I intend to find out before the week is finished." Across the city, in the small kitchen above her mother's shop, Elena found herself facing a very different kind of attention that afternoon. Word of the previous evening had reached the neighborhood as well, carried by customers who arrived at the shop with more curiosity about the gossip than genuine business for the seamstress's needle. "Is it true the Duke himself knelt before you?" asked one woman, a regular customer named Grace Whitfield, her eyes bright with excitement as she waited for a simple mending to be completed. "It was not quite as dramatic as I am sure the story has become," Elena said carefully, keeping her eyes on her work, hoping to discourage further questions through simple lack of engagement. "They say he sent you home in his own carriage," Grace pressed, undeterred. "He was concerned about an injury, that is all." Clara, working at the counter nearby, watched her daughter's careful, guarded responses with quiet approval. She understood better than anyone the danger of feeding gossip, how quickly a story could spiral beyond anyone's control once it gained enough momentum among curious tongues eager for something new to discuss. But even Clara could not entirely shield her daughter from the consequences of the previous evening's events. By late afternoon, a messenger arrived at the shop's door, dressed in the fine livery of the Duke's household, carrying a small, sealed letter addressed simply to Miss Elena Marchetti. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, aware of her mother watching from across the room with poorly concealed curiosity. The letter was brief, written in a clean, confident hand that suggested careful composition rather than hasty scrawling. "Miss Marchetti, I trust you are recovering well. I would be grateful for the opportunity to speak with you further regarding a matter of some importance to my household. If it would not inconvenience you, I would welcome your presence at the estate tomorrow afternoon, at whatever hour suits your schedule best. Yours with continued gratitude for your patience last evening, Alessandro Varon." Elena read the letter twice, searching the careful, formal words for some clue as to what exactly he wished to discuss. But the message revealed nothing beyond a simple, polite invitation. She looked up to find her mother watching her with an expression somewhere between concern and cautious hope.
"What does he want?"
Clara asked. "He does not say," Elena admitted, folding the letter carefully and setting it on the table between them. "Only that he wishes to speak with me about something important." Clara was quiet for a long moment, studying her daughter's face with the particular attentiveness of a mother who had spent years learning to read the subtle signs of her child's thoughts. "And what do you wish to do?" Elena considered the question carefully. Every instinct honed by years of careful, cautious living told her to decline politely. to return to the safety of anonymity and let the strange events of the previous evening fade quietly into memory. Yet something else, some quieter curiosity she could not fully explain, pulled her toward accepting the invitation, toward learning more about the man who had shown her such unexpected, inexplicable kindness. "I think," she said finally, "that I should go and hear what he has to say." Clara nodded slowly, though worry remained visible in the lines of her face. "Be careful, Elena. Whatever kindness he showed you last night, he remains a duke, and you remain a seamstress's daughter. The distance between those two positions does not close simply because of one unusual evening." "I know, Mama," Elena said quietly. "I will be careful." But even as she spoke the reassurance, she found herself thinking of the Duke's face, as he had spoken of someone who suffered quietly and went unnoticed, and she wondered, despite every warning her own good sense offered, what exactly awaited her at the grand estate the following afternoon. The estate looked entirely different in the pale afternoon light than it had under the glow of 100 candles the night before. Elena arrived on foot this time, having declined the offer of another carriage out of a lingering discomfort with such unfamiliar luxury, and stood for a moment at the base of the wide stone steps, gathering her courage before approaching the grand front entrance. A footman recognized her immediately, ushering her inside with none of the confusion or suspicion she had half expected, and led her through quiet, sunlit corridors toward a small private study, rather than the grand rooms she remembered from the previous evening. The house felt entirely different by daylight, less overwhelming, more simply a place where people lived and worked, rather than a stage for glittering spectacle. The Duke rose from behind a large wooden desk when she entered, setting aside a stack of papers he had been reviewing. He looked less formal than she remembered, dressed simply, his expression carrying none of the guarded composure he had worn among his guests the previous night. "Miss Marchetti," he said, gesturing toward a comfortable chair positioned near the window. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." Elena settled into the offered chair, folding her hands carefully in her lap, uncertain what to expect from this meeting. "Your letter mentioned a matter of importance, Your Grace." "Yes," he said, taking the chair across from her rather than retreating behind the formality of his desk. "Though I confess the matter is somewhat more personal than official business." Elena waited, watching him carefully, aware of a slight hesitation in his manner that had not been present the previous night, when his actions had carried the confident certainty of a man who knew exactly what needed to be done, regardless of how it might appear to others. "I wish to apologize," he said finally, "for the manner in which I handled last evening's events. I acted quickly, without fully considering how such public attention might affect you, your reputation, your family's standing with my household. That was thoughtless of me." Elena had not expected an apology, and for a moment she was uncertain how to respond. "Your Grace, you showed me great kindness. I have no complaint against your actions." "Perhaps not," he said, "but I have heard the whispers that have followed since. I understand society is not always kind toward those who find themselves at the center of gossip through no fault of their own." "The gossip will fade," Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain she believed them. "It always does, eventually." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing his expression. "You are remarkably composed about a situation that must have caused you considerable difficulty." "I have learned to be composed, Your Grace. It has served me well." "I imagine it has," he said quietly, "though I wonder sometimes whether such composure comes at its own cost." Elena felt a flicker of surprise at the perceptiveness of the observation, uncertain how a man who had known her for less than a day could sense something about her that even her closest neighbors rarely noticed. She said nothing, waiting to see where his thoughts might lead. "I told you last night," he continued, "that I once knew someone who suffered quietly, without ever asking for help, until it was too late to matter. That person was my sister." Elena's expression softened immediately, understanding now the deeper weight behind his actions the previous evening. "I am sorry, Your Grace. It was many years ago," he said, "but I have carried the lesson of it ever since. I do not wish to see the same pattern repeat itself in anyone under my care or within my household, however distant or brief their connection to it might be." "Is that why you sent for me today? To explain your actions?" "Partly," he admitted, "but also because I find myself curious about you, Miss Marchetti. beyond the simple circumstances of last night's events. You handled a difficult, embarrassing situation with remarkable grace, and I confess, I would like to understand more of the person capable of such composure." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks at the directness of the admission, uncertain how to respond to interest so plainly stated by a man of his position. "Your Grace, I am simply a seamstress's daughter. There is little of interest in my circumstances that would warrant such curiosity." "I disagree," he said simply, "though I understand your hesitation to believe it." They spoke for the better part of an hour, the conversation drifting gradually away from the formal distance of their first exchange into something easier, more genuine, as the Duke asked careful questions about her work, her family's small shop, the quiet satisfaction she found in skilled needlework despite the long hours and modest reward it offered. Elena found herself answering more openly than she had intended, drawn in by the evident sincerity of his interest, so different from the polite indifference she typically encountered from those of higher standing. When she finally rose to leave, the afternoon light had begun to soften toward evening, and something in the easy warmth of their conversation had shifted the careful distance she had maintained since arriving. "Might I call on you again?" the Duke asked, as he walked her toward the entrance himself, rather than summoning a servant for the task. "Not regarding any matter of importance this time, simply to continue our conversation, if you would permit it." Elena hesitated, aware of every practical reason to decline, the impossible distance between their respective positions, the near certainty of further gossip should such visits become known, the simple, sensible caution her mother had urged upon her the previous evening. Yet something in his careful, hopeful expression made refusal feel impossible. "I would not object to that, Your Grace," she said finally. His answering smile was small, but genuine, carrying none of the practiced formality she had grown accustomed to seeing on the faces of the wealthy. "Then I shall look forward to it, Miss Marchetti." She left the estate that evening, with far more to consider than she had arrived with, uncertain what exactly was beginning between them, but aware, with a growing sense of quiet wonder, that whatever it was, it did not feel like something she wished to walk away from. The visits continued over the following weeks, each one a little longer than the last, each one drawing Elena further from the careful, guarded world she had built for herself, and into something she had never expected to experience. The Duke came to the small shop himself on several occasions, dressed plainly enough to avoid immediate recognition on the street, though word inevitably spread regardless, carried by curious neighbors who noticed the same fine carriage returning again and again to the narrow lane between the bakery and the shoemaker. Lady Beatrice Ashworth, true to her earlier determination, had continued her careful inquiries, and by the time a full month had passed since the ball, she had assembled enough fragments of truth to satisfy most of her curiosity, though she kept much of what she learned to herself, uncertain what to make of a Duke who seemed genuinely, quietly devoted to a seamstress, rather than merely entertaining a passing fascination. Not everyone in society shared her restraint. Whispers grew bolder as the weeks passed, some cruel, suggesting Elena had somehow manipulated the entire situation from the beginning, that the injury to her feet had been staged for sympathy, that she was nothing more than an opportunist, seeking to climb far beyond her proper station through calculated performance. Others were kinder, even romantic, framing the story as a rare and touching example of genuine connection, crossing the rigid boundaries of class that governed so much of their world. Elena bore the growing attention with the same quiet composure she had shown that first difficult evening, though the strain of it occasionally showed in small, private moments when she believed no one was watching. Her mother, ever perceptive, noticed the toll it took, the careful way Elena had begun avoiding certain streets where gossip seemed most concentrated, the tension in her shoulders whenever a customer's questions grew too pointed. "You do not have to continue this," Clara said one evening, as they sat together over a simple meal, the shop closed and quiet around them. "If the attention has become too much, you could simply decline his next visit. No one would think less of you for choosing peace over difficulty." Elena considered the offer carefully before answering. "I have thought of that, Mama. But I find that despite everything, despite the whispers and the difficulty, I do not wish to end it. There is something real in his attention, something I have not encountered before in my life, and I am not ready to walk away from it simply because others find it inconvenient to accept." Clara studied her daughter's face for a long moment, seeing in it a quiet determination she recognized from her own younger years. before circumstances and hardship had worn much of that fire down into careful practicality. Then we shall face whatever comes together, as we always have. The true test of the growing whispers arrived, not through idle gossip in the street, but through a formal visit from Lady Beatrice Ashworth herself, who arrived at the small shop one afternoon, with the evident intention of settling her curiosity once and for all, through direct conversation, rather than second-hand inquiry. "Miss Marchetti," Beatrice said, settling herself into the shop's single comfortable chair, with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being accommodated wherever she went. "I hope you will forgive my directness, but I find myself unable to resist asking you plainly. What exactly is your intention regarding the Duke?" Elena, caught off guard by the bluntness of the question, took a moment to compose her response. "I have no particular intention beyond enjoying his company when he chooses to offer it, my lady. I have not sought anything beyond that." "And yet the entire city speaks of little else these past weeks," Beatrice pressed. "Surely you understand the position this places him in, the questions it raises among those who expect him to marry within his own standing, to secure alliances and connections that benefit the family name he carries." "I understand it very well, my lady," Elena said quietly, meeting the older woman's sharp gaze without flinching. "I have thought of little else since this began, but I did not seek his attention, and I have made no demands upon him, beyond simple honesty in how we treat one another. Whatever happens between us, or does not happen, will be decided by him and by me, not by the expectations of those observing from outside." Something shifted in Lady Beatrice's expression, at the quiet firmness of the response, a flicker of grudging respect replacing her earlier suspicion. "You are more composed than I expected, given the circumstances." "I have had a great deal of practice remaining composed, my lady," Elena said. "It is perhaps the one skill my circumstances have taught me most thoroughly." Beatrice studied her for a long moment longer before rising to leave, her expression thoughtful rather than hostile. "I will admit, Miss Marchetti, that I came here today expecting to find someone calculating, someone seeking to profit from an unusual circumstance. I find instead someone rather more genuine than the gossip suggests. Whether that changes anything remains to be seen, but I thought you should know my assessment has shifted." Elena watched her go, uncertain what to make of the strange visit, but grateful nonetheless for the small validation it offered, against the weight of so much unkind speculation. She returned to her work that evening with a lighter heart than she had carried in weeks, sensing perhaps that the worst of the difficult scrutiny had begun, slowly, to pass. Spring arrived slowly that year, the cold winter finally loosening its grip on the narrow streets around the small shop, and with it came a change in the Duke's manner that Elena noticed almost immediately during his next visit. He arrived on a quiet afternoon, when the shop stood empty of customers, his usual easy conversation replaced by a careful, almost nervous formality that seemed entirely out of character for a man she had come to know as steady and direct in nearly everything he did. "Miss Marchetti," he began, standing rather than taking his usual seat near the window, "I have come today with a specific purpose, rather than simply the pleasure of your company, though that remains true as well." Elena set aside the fabric she had been working with, sensing the significance of his unusual manner. "What is it, Your Grace?" "I have spent these past months considering carefully what I wish for my future, and I find that every consideration leads back to the same conclusion," he said, his words careful and deliberate, as though he had rehearsed them many times before finally speaking them aloud. "I do not wish to continue these visits as simple friendly calls, pleasant though they have been. I wish to court you properly, Elena, with the full intention of asking for your hand, should you find yourself willing to accept such an offer in time." Elena stood very still, the weight of his words settling slowly over her, both wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. "Your Grace, you understand what such a thing would mean. The scandal that has already followed us would grow immeasurably. Your family's expectations, the standing of your household, all of it would be affected by such a choice." "I understand it fully," he said. "I have considered every objection 100 times over these past weeks, and I find that none of them outweigh what I have come to feel in your company. I am not asking you to decide anything today. I am simply asking your permission to pursue this properly, honestly, without the shadow of gossip and speculation hanging over every visit." Elena thought of her mother's careful warnings, of Lady Beatrice's pointed questions, of the whispers that had followed her through the streets these past months. She thought too of the quiet, genuine connection that had grown between herself and this man over their many conversations. The ease she had come to feel in his presence, despite every practical reason such ease should have felt impossible. "I would need to speak with my mother," she said finally, "before I could give you any answer." "Of course," he said, relief evident in his expression, at her willingness to consider the request rather than refuse it outright. "Take whatever time you require. I will wait for your answer, however long it takes to arrive at one." That evening, Elena sat with her mother in the familiar warmth of their small kitchen, recounting the Duke's request with careful honesty, holding nothing back, despite the vulnerability such openness required. Clara listened quietly, her expression difficult to read, until Elena finally finished speaking, and waited anxiously for her mother's response. "Do you love him?" Clara asked simply, cutting through every practical consideration to the single question that mattered most. Elena considered the question with the same careful honesty she had brought to every part of her account. "I believe I do, Mama, though I have tried, many times these past weeks, to convince myself otherwise, believing it safer, easier, less likely to end in heartbreak. And has that effort succeeded?" "No," Elena admitted, a small, rueful smile crossing her face. "It has not." Clara reached across the table and took her daughter's hand in her own, her expression softening into something warm and encouraging, despite the very real difficulties such a union would face. "Then perhaps, my dear, it is time to stop trying to convince yourself of anything, and instead simply allow yourself to accept what you already know to be true." Elena's answer to the Duke, when she finally gave it a few days later, was simple and quiet, delivered in the same small study where he had first spoken his intentions. He received it with a joy so evident, so unguarded, that Elena found herself laughing softly at the sight of it, struck by how different this moment felt from the careful, formal distance of their very first meeting on that crowded ballroom floor months earlier. Their courtship, once officially acknowledged, drew exactly the kind of attention Elena had feared, whispers and speculation continuing to follow them through every public appearance together. But something had shifted in how she carried that attention now. The fear of it replaced gradually by a quiet confidence that whatever society chose to say, the truth of what she and Alessandro had built together mattered far more than any gossip's power to diminish it. Lady Beatrice Ashworth, true to the shift in her assessment months earlier, became one of their earliest and most vocal supporters among the noble circles that had initially greeted the pairing with suspicion, her first-hand account of Elena's genuine character carrying considerable weight among those who valued her judgment. Years later, long after the wedding had come and gone, long after the initial scandal had faded into the kind of story told fondly rather than scornfully at social gatherings, visitors to the grand estate would sometimes notice a particular section of the ballroom's marble floor, polished so thoroughly over time that it gleamed slightly differently from the surrounding stone, worn smooth by countless careful cleanings that had long ago removed every trace of what had once marked it. The Duchess Elena Varon, when asked occasionally about the section of floor and the story attached to it, would simply smile and say that some moments left their mark not on the marble itself, but on the people who witnessed them, and that the truest measure of a person's character was not found in how they behaved when everyone was watching, but in whether they still noticed the quiet suffering of others when it would have been far easier simply to look away. The ballroom continued to host grand events for many years afterward, filled with new generations of dancers and musicians, and glittering candlelight, none of them aware of the particular evening, long past, when an entire ball had stopped in its tracks for the sake of a single overlooked young woman, and the quiet, unshakable kindness of a duke who had simply refused to look away.